Every night, a small golden puppy curls up outside the cold doors of St. Mary's Hospital, eyes fixed on the entrance, waiting for someone who will never come out. He doesn't bark. He doesn't beg. He just waits, with the kind of quiet loyalty that breaks hearts. When a weary doctor finally notices and uncovers the truth, the story behind that little dog's vigil will shatter him, and change everything. The town of Elmsworth was quiet, especially at night. The narrow streets, lined with old brick houses and gas lamps, emptied out once the sun sank behind the rolling hills. The only sounds that broke the silence were the occasional creak of a windmill or the soft rustling of leaves. But at the corner of Rosehill Street, where the town's heart pulsed, stood St. Mary's General Hospital, its windows glowing like quiet stars in the night sky. It was a place where life often began and sometimes where it came to an end. The hum of the building's steady routine never truly stopped, even in the darkest hours. And in those hours, a small, scruffy puppy would appear. Just as the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky, Buddy would arrive, his little golden body a stark contrast against the dark concrete of the hospital's entrance. He wasn't a large dog, just small enough to slip under the radar, but he had a quiet dignity about him. His fur, once a bright and healthy shade of gold, had started to mat with dirt and wear, yet there was an undeniable warmth in his eyes. Each night, without fail, he would settle on the cold pavement in front of the sliding glass doors, his body curled into a ball as he stared patiently at the hospital's entrance. The staff noticed him first. Nurse Julia was the first to offer him a scrap of her sandwich after her shift, noticing the way his sad eyes seemed to follow her as she walked out of the building. She crouched down, extending a hand toward him. The puppy sniffed the food cautiously before snatching it up in one quick gulp, as though he hadn't eaten in days. But he didn't stay long after that. He only lingered for a moment before returning to his spot by the door, eyes once again fixed on the entrance. As the days turned into weeks, more and more of the hospital staff grew fond of the little dog. Doctors, nurses, and even the janitors began to leave scraps of food for him. A few of the night shift workers would throw him a ball or run their hands over his soft coat during their breaks. The puppy never seemed to mind the attention, though he rarely wagged his tail. His movements were slow, deliberate. There was a quiet, unspoken sadness in the way he carried himself. He would nudge a hand for a pet, but once it was over he would return to his place, always back at the front of the hospital, never straying far from that spot. They called him Buddy. No one really knew where Buddy had come from, or why he had chosen St. Mary's to make his nightly vigil. Some whispered he was a stray, abandoned by an uncaring owner. Others suggested that he must belong to someone inside the hospital, a patient or a visitor who had to leave him behind. There were even rumors that Buddy was waiting for someone special to come home from the hospital, though no one could quite say who. But whatever the reason, Buddy came back. Night after night, rain or frost, he returned to his post. The cold wind would blow through the streets, and the hospital would be a hub of activity, but Buddy remained outside, his eyes unwaveringly fixed on the glass doors, as though watching for someone who would never appear. To everyone else he was just another stray dog. But to the staff at St. Mary's, Buddy became something more. He was their little guardian. A reminder that, even in the darkest moments, loyalty and love had a place, no matter how small or unspoken it might be. And every night he waited. Dr. Adrian Keller was not a man prone to sentiment. He didn't have time for it. As a top-tier surgeon at St. Mary's, Adrian's world was governed by logic, precision, and results. Emotions had no place in an operating room, and certainly not in his personal life. After years of sleepless nights and endless hours of focus, he had built a fortress around his heart, keeping out everything that could make him vulnerable. He threw himself into his work, poring over medical journals, analyzing clinical data, and rarely taking a moment to breathe outside of the sterile walls of the hospital. People came and went from his life. Patients were numbers on a chart, not faces with stories. He was there to fix bodies, not hearts. At least that's what he told himself. But that night something was different. Dr. Keller had just finished a 12-hour emergency surgery. His body ached, his mind felt foggy, and exhaustion weighed on his every step as he exited the sterile, brightly lit operating room. The hum of hospital life surrounded him, but everything felt distant, blurry, like a painting half-finished. The adrenaline rush from the surgery was wearing off, leaving only fatigue in its wake. As he passed through the glass doors that led to the hospital's main entrance, something unusual caught his eye. There, curled up on the cold concrete at the foot of the automatic doors, was the small golden puppy. Buddy. The same puppy that had been an almost invisible fixture outside for weeks. Adrian had seen him before but never paid much attention. To him, Buddy was just another stray, nothing more than an inconvenience. A reminder of the many problems in the world that he couldn't fix. But tonight, as the puppy slowly lifted his head to gaze at the doctor, something in Adrian's chest tightened. It wasn't the hunger in the dog's eyes, or the way he looked as if he might have been lost. No, it was the sadness. The quiet, aching sadness that reflected in those amber eyes. It pierced through Adrian's well-guarded armor and pulled him into a place he hadn't visited in years. Empathy. For a long moment, Adrian simply stood there, staring down at the little dog. The world around him felt muted, as though everything had been temporarily put on pause. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant chatter from the ER, the hurried footsteps of nurses, all faded into the background. Only Buddy remained in sharp focus. Adrian took a tentative step closer, his instincts as a doctor taking over. He crouched down to the pup's level, his fingers slowly extending towards him. There was a sense of hesitation, but Buddy didn't pull away. The puppy sniffed the air, then cautiously sniffed Adrian's hand before gently licking his fingers. Just once, a brief, almost imperceptible gesture. It wasn't the frantic, hungry licking of an animal starved for attention. It was soft, almost resigned. Adrian's heart stuttered, and before he could stop himself, he whispered, "Who are you waiting for?" Buddy didn't answer. He couldn't. But his eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, spoke volumes. Adrian could see the pain there, the quiet suffering that hadn't gone unnoticed by anyone who happened to glance in his direction. The kind of pain that only a dog waiting for someone could understand. Adrian's hand hovered over Buddy's head, but he didn't pet him. Instead, he just sat there, frozen in the moment, feeling something in him shift. The wall he had carefully built for years began to crack, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like the doctor in control of every situation. He was simply a man, sitting beside a creature who carried a weight he couldn't comprehend. Buddy rested his head back on his paws, his gaze still fixed on the hospital doors. And though he was surrounded by the hum of life continuing inside, there was something profoundly still about him. Waiting. Hoping. Adrian swallowed hard, fighting back an unfamiliar lump in his throat. He didn't know what had come over him. He wasn't supposed to feel this way. But the sadness that radiated from the little dog was like a mirror, reflecting everything Adrian had buried in himself for so long. The puppy didn't need to speak. His eyes said it all. "I'm waiting for someone who isn't coming back." For a moment, Dr. Keller's professional detachment faltered. He felt the weight of the world in Buddy's quiet vigil, and it unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. As he stood up and walked back into the hospital, the sound of his footsteps seemed louder than usual. The doors slid shut behind him, and for the first time in years, Adrian couldn't shake the feeling that he had just left something important behind. He wasn't sure what that something was yet, but he would find out soon enough. Dr. Adrian Keller couldn't shake the image of Buddy's sad, waiting eyes. Every time he closed his own, he saw them again, those eyes full of loss and longing. He thought about the puppy all through the night shift, the memory of the golden fur, the quiet sadness. He tried to write it off as an odd distraction, but it gnawed at him, lodged somewhere deep within him, like a splinter he couldn't remove. The next day he found himself standing in front of the hospital records room, his hand hovering over the door. He told himself it was just curiosity. After all, he wasn't one to get involved with stray animals or sentimental stories. But something had changed inside him. Buddy's presence felt like a puzzle, and Adrian, the man who prided himself on solving every problem, couldn't help but seek the answers. He began asking around. The janitor, Mr. Carver, was the first to talk. He was an old man with silver hair and a deep, gravelly voice. His eyes, though tired, had a knowing quality. When Adrian asked about the dog, Carver simply nodded. Oh, that pup? Been here a while now. Months at least. He's here almost every night like clockwork. Never barks, never moves. Just waits. He paused, then added with a sigh, poor thing, looks like he's waiting for someone, but no one ever comes. Adrian's curiosity only deepened. There was something in Carver's words that lingered, a feeling of abandonment in them, as though the janitor knew more than he was willing to say. Later that evening, Dr. Keller found Nurse Diane, who had worked the night shifts for years. She was tough but kind, with a sharp eye for detail. She knew everyone's story, or so it seemed. When he asked about Buddy, her face softened. I remember the first time I saw him, Diane said, adjusting her glasses. It was about 6 months ago, around the same time we lost Maria Alston in the ICU. I don't think the puppy was here before that. Maybe he came with her? I don't know. I didn't think much of it at the time, but the timing is strange, don't you think? Maria Alston. The name struck Dr. Keller like a bolt of lightning. He had been the one to pronounce Maria's death in that very ICU. A 27-year-old woman who had been in a horrific car accident, her body too broken to save. He remembered her pale face, the steady beeping of machines, the way her family had been too distraught to be there in the final hours. Adrian knew that Maria had passed away alone. There were no family members present during her last moments. The ICU had made arrangements for her funeral, but there had been no one to claim her belongings. No one except the mysterious visitor who had come every day to see her, Ethan Alston, her little brother. Adrian had seen the young man only once, his grief palpable, his face a mixture of sorrow and helplessness. Ethan had been barely 18, and it was clear from the start that he was struggling to come to terms with what had happened. Adrian's thoughts were a blur as he turned away from Nurse Diane and hurried to the records department. Back in his office, Adrian opened Maria Alston's file. He knew the details by heart, the traumatic injuries, the complications that had followed, and the eventual death that had occurred after a series of unsuccessful surgeries. But this time, his focus wasn't on the medical chart. He was looking for something else. His eyes scanned the paperwork carefully, medical reports, bills, the standard discharge notices, and then he found it. Tucked in a corner of the file, a small, crumpled letter. It was handwritten, its ink smudged in places as though it had been folded and refolded too many times. Adrian unfolded it gently, his heart racing with each word. Take care of Buddy for me, okay? He's all I have left. A simple request. But the weight of it, the raw emotion behind the words, struck him like a physical blow. Maria had known she was leaving her brother, and in that final heart-wrenching moment, she had made sure to ask someone to care for her dog. Adrian felt a pang of guilt. He should have known. He should have seen it in her eyes, the desperation, the need for some semblance of hope before she let go. As he turned the page, Adrian's breath caught in his throat. A photograph. It was a patient photo from her time in the hospital, taken when she was still conscious, still fighting. She was lying in her bed, weak but smiling. And in her lap, nestled contentedly, was Buddy, the same golden puppy he had seen outside every night. Buddy hadn't just wandered into the hospital. He hadn't just been abandoned or forgotten. He was her dog. The one thing Maria had asked for before she died, the one thing she wanted to make sure would be cared for. And now here was Buddy alone, still waiting. Adrian closed his eyes, the truth settling over him like a heavy blanket. The puppy wasn't just a stray. He wasn't just a dog. He was the last piece of Maria's life, the last connection to the love and loss she had left behind. And somehow, against all odds, Buddy had chosen to wait for the one person he thought would return. But Maria was gone. And Buddy? Buddy was waiting for a brother who would never come back. Adrian swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he placed the file back down on the desk. The world outside felt colder now, and for the first time in years, the walls Adrian had built around his heart began to crumble. The morning light filtered through the trees in the hospital garden, casting soft shadows on the grass. Dr. Adrian Keller sat on a weathered bench, his eyes unfocused, the air still and heavy around him. Buddy, the golden puppy, was curled up at his feet as always. The little dog had a quiet presence that Adrian had come to rely on over the past few days. His steady breathing, the slight shift of his body as he slept, the gentle rise and fall of his chest. It was the only sound that grounded Adrian in a world that now felt too big, too loud. For the first time in years, Adrian felt something deep in his chest. A tightness, a lump he couldn't explain. It wasn't the familiar strain of exhaustion from another long shift. It wasn't the quiet hum of stress, the constant burden of responsibility that he had carried for so long. No, this was different. It was grief. A raw, unspoken grief that crept up on him when he least expected it. He thought of Maria, the young woman whose life had been cut short in the most tragic of ways. He thought of Ethan, her little brother, who had lost not just a sibling but the only person who had ever truly understood him. And he thought of Buddy, the golden puppy who had waited every night, every moment, for someone who would never return. Buddy had no idea that Maria was gone. He didn't understand death or loss, or what it meant to wait for someone who would never come home. But he waited anyway. Every night, without fail, he returned to the hospital. He lay outside as if the cold concrete was his post, his station, and he would never leave. He didn't bark. He didn't beg for attention. He just waited. Adrian ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the past pressing down on him. He couldn't help but wonder what had happened to Ethan. He had never returned to the hospital. Not once. It seemed like he had disappeared, unable, or unwilling, to face the memories that lingered here. Maybe the pain of losing his sister was too much. Maybe he had moved on, burying the past with every step he took. Or maybe, just maybe, Ethan was gone too. Adrian didn't know, and he wasn't sure if he would ever get an answer. But Buddy? Buddy had never stopped waiting. Every night, no matter the weather, no matter how harsh or cold the winds blew, Buddy was there. He didn't move from his spot, didn't wander off to find another place to sleep. His vigil was unwavering. His loyalty was endless. Adrian's mind drifted, and for a moment he was back in his own past. A different time, a different place. He remembered his mother, the woman who had raised him with love and sacrifice. He remembered the phone call in the middle of a long surgery, the one that told him she was gone. He had been working across the country at the time. He had tried to make it back in time, but he had failed. The memory of that night, of her cold body in the sterile hospital room, still haunted him. He had never made it. He had never forgiven himself for not being there when she needed him most. And maybe that was why Buddy's devotion hurt so much. Because, in a way, it was a reminder of Adrian's own failure to be there when it counted. Buddy's loyalty was a kind of purity that Adrian hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. It was a love that transcended logic, a devotion that didn't need explanations or justifications. It was simply there, unbroken, undeterred by time or loss. Adrian closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He thought of Buddy, so small, so vulnerable, yet so determined to wait for someone who was never coming back. It was as if the puppy had a heart too big for this world, a heart that couldn't understand why things had to change, why people had to leave. The puppy's quiet, unrelenting love stirred something in Adrian's soul, something long buried. It was an ache that couldn't be ignored, a truth he had been avoiding for far too long. The bond between a person and an animal was simple but profound. Animals didn't need words to show their devotion. They didn't need reason. They just loved. And in that moment, as he sat with Buddy in the garden, Adrian understood something he hadn't fully realized before. Buddy wasn't just waiting for Maria. He was waiting for anyone. He was waiting for a family, for a home, for someone who would love him back. His devotion wasn't just to the memory of his former owner. It was to the hope that one day someone would notice him, someone would care. Adrian's heart ached at the thought. He had spent so much of his life locking away his feelings, hiding behind his work, avoiding the emotional connections that could tear him apart. But here, in the garden, with Buddy at his feet, he realized something that made his chest tighten with emotion. Sometimes devotion was the only thing that kept a person, or a dog, going. Maybe it was time for Adrian to stop running from his own grief. Maybe it was time for him to face what he had been avoiding. He could see now that Buddy's unwavering devotion had the power to heal, to remind him that love, true, unshakable love, never ended, even when a heartbeat stopped. With a shaky breath, Adrian reached down and gently patted Buddy's golden head. The puppy stirred slightly, looking up at him with those same sad, knowing eyes, and then resting his head back down on the soft grass. For the first time in years, Adrian allowed himself to feel what Buddy had always known, that love in all its forms had the power to endure. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to start healing. That night, the rain fell relentlessly, turning the quiet streets of Elmsworth into raging rivers of water. The wind howled, shaking the trees and rattling the windows of St. Mary's General Hospital. Thunder rolled over the town like a growl from the heavens, and the sky flickered with the jagged light of lightning. The storm was fierce, relentless, much like the years of grief that had quietly torn at Adrian's soul. Inside the hospital, Dr. Adrian Keller stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the darkened street outside. The rain blurred everything, streetlights, cars, and the path that led to the entrance. But in the midst of the storm, there was one thing he could see clearly. Buddy. The little golden puppy, soaked through, sat as he always had, still, unwavering, waiting. His tiny body shivered against the torrential downpour, yet he didn't move from his spot. His eyes, dull and tired, remained fixed on the hospital doors as if expecting someone to walk through them. But no one ever did. Not for him. Adrian's chest tightened with a mix of emotions he couldn't explain. He had tried to ignore it, tried to tell himself that Buddy was just a dog, that it wasn't his problem. But standing there in the storm, watching the puppy wait in silence, something inside Adrian snapped. It wasn't just the weather that felt heavy, it was the weight of the truth, the weight of all the pain and loss he had carried for so long. The tears welled up in his eyes, unbidden, hot and sharp. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white against the cold glass, trying to hold back the flood of emotions he had buried deep inside for years. But he couldn't. Not anymore. A realization flooded him. The weight of it was unbearable, yet it was the most freeing feeling he had ever known. He wasn't just watching Buddy. He was seeing himself, his own pain, his own waiting, his own unresolved grief. Buddy had waited long enough. Adrian's breath hitched as the floodgates finally opened, and for the first time in his adult life, he let himself feel everything. The grief over his mother, the regret for the patients he hadn't been able to save, the remorse for the relationships he had neglected in favor of work. But most of all, the aching sorrow for the lonely puppy, who had waited without question, without complaint, for someone to take him home. And Adrian realized that it was him. He was the one who could give Buddy that home. He could stop the waiting, stop the loneliness. He couldn't undo all the lost moments in his own life, but maybe he could give this little dog the one thing he needed: love. And maybe, just maybe, it was time Adrian allowed himself to receive it as well. Without another thought, he threw on his coat and bolted for the door. The rain battered his face as he ran toward Buddy, his coat flapping in the wind like the wings of a bird desperately trying to take flight. The puddles splashed under his feet, but he didn't care. Nothing mattered except getting to that little dog, the one who had waited longer than anyone should have to. When Adrian reached Buddy, he knelt down in front of him, his heart pounding in his chest. The puppy's fur was drenched and his body trembled from the cold. But when their eyes met, something shifted. The years of waiting, of longing for someone to care, were reflected in Buddy's gaze. And in that moment the puppy seemed to know. Adrian reached down, his hands gentle but firm, and scooped Buddy up, cradling him close to his chest. The little dog's body trembled, not just from the cold now, but from the relief of finally being held. Buddy nuzzled into Adrian's warmth, his shivering subsiding as he found comfort in the doctor's embrace. Adrian whispered through the storm, his voice thick with emotion. "You've waited long enough." Buddy's head rested against Adrian's chest, his small body curling into the warmth of the man who had been so emotionally distant for so long, but who, in that moment, was finally truly present. "She's not coming back, but I'll take you home," Adrian promised, his voice cracking with the weight of his own emotions. "I promise." The storm raged on, but for Adrian the world had quieted. He stood in the rain, holding the little dog, and for the first time in his life, he allowed himself to cry. Not out of frustration, not out of the relentless pressure of his job, but out of grief. Grief for Maria, for Buddy, for his mother, for all the souls he couldn't save. He cried for every patient who had passed under his care, every relationship he had neglected, every moment he had missed by refusing to feel. But in the midst of the tears there was healing. There was release. And Buddy wasn't waiting anymore. Adrian walked back toward the hospital. Buddy nestled safely in his arms. The storm continued to pour down on them, but for the first time in ages, Adrian felt something different, a kind of peace that had long eluded him. By the time they reached Adrian's car, the puppy had stopped trembling. His head was tucked under Adrian's chin, and his breathing had slowed into a steady rhythm, as if he knew deep down that he had found a home at last. A home where someone cared, someone would love him. And for the first time in years, Adrian felt it too. Buddy had his home. And now so did Adrian. As they drove away from the hospital, the storm began to fade, and the first hints of dawn broke through the heavy clouds. The world felt fresh, alive again. For the first time, the weight of all that had been left unsaid, of all the waiting and loss, seemed a little lighter. They were both home. Together. And Adrian finally had someone to remind him how to feel.